So first of all, it's an absolute pleasure to be here to speak to you guys as members of PAM. Now, this is a program that we developed originally as part of a small mini grant from Kraft Oscar Mayer Foods. The original intent was to just focus this programming on the small and very small meat processors in the state of Wisconsin. It worked out really, really well that Aaron reached out and asked if we could do a program like this for you guys as well, because the timing was perfect. I was already working on the materials for you, we had some of the funds available, and so we just rolled this program right into what we were already doing in Wisconsin. Of course, when we set up programs like this, it takes an army. It's usually not one person that brings it all together. So this slide acknowledges the people that have played a role in getting these materials together. So thank you to everybody who's played a role in that. Now, before I can get into the fun stuff, you could say, before we can start pulling out split beef heads and pork heads and start looking at stunners and testing, I've got to walk you through a little bit of why what we're doing here is important. We have to justify why humane slaughter is something that we need to pay attention to. For many, it's just for the sake of doing the right thing. For others, it may take a little more convincing. So the place where I want to start is actually talking a little bit about the concept of animal welfare in general. When we hear animal welfare, I'd imagine there are a lot of people in the room that think about dietary choices, and they think about activist groups, and they may not be thinking about what exactly the core of animal welfare is. When we look at what animal welfare is, the global definition that's actually accepted for animal welfare is how an animal is coping with the environment in which it lives. Now, if you look at that definition, the thing I want you to really remember here is that it is totally animal focused. There are no people mentioned in that definition. When it comes to animal welfare, we are focused on the animal. Now, this is our starting point here. So what does that mean? All right, we're working with this definition of how an animal is coping with the environment in which it lives. We're talking about the word welfare. Essentially what this means is that in order for anything to have welfare, it has to have the ability to cope. In order for you to have welfare, you have to be able to cope, or have some opportunity at least. Same thing with animals, all right? The chair that you're sitting in does not have the opportunity to cope. For some of you that are a little heavier, that's probably a good thing for the chair, if it would have had welfare. So, in any case, the point I'm trying to make here is that the animal has to be alive and conscious in order to have welfare. And so if we think about where welfare is and where it is not in meat processing, welfare ends the second we have a successful stun that lasts. That's where welfare ends. All the way up to that point, anything we do to the animal matters to the animal. So if we do something wrong and we cause harm, that animal's going to suffer. So that's why we really have to focus on just when the animal is alive. That's where this part is focused. Once we're hanging on the rail and we're more or less bled out, at that point, animal welfare doesn't exist anymore. Now, the other thing to remember with this too is that if you look at this, what I've just gone over with you guys, it's really important to remember that dietary choices have absolutely nothing to do with animal welfare in particular in this case. All right? We're only focused on the animal. And so this is the last time I'll actually get into that stuff, because I want you to think about animal welfare just from the standpoint of doing what's right by the animal. So why does the welfare of the animal matter? It matters, well, first, because it definitely matters to the animal. It also matters to the people that handle the animal. Those of you that slaughter livestock know that an animal that is agitated is more dangerous to handle. So if we can keep an animal calm, it's better for that animal's well-being. It's also better for the handler's well-being. It also matters to the people that eat the animal. It matters on several levels for them. It could matter from a quality standpoint. We know that pre-slaughter stress can reduce meat quality, but it can also matter from a thought standpoint. That if something bad happens in your facility and somebody catches it, and that gets linked to your brand, then in that case, there's not necessarily like a direct product quality attribute, like tenderness or juiciness or color, anything like that, but it's the thought of your name associated with the product that ultimately results in a reduction in perceived quality by the consumer. So it matters to the people that eat the animal. It matters to the yield and quality of the product that you take from that animal. And last, and this is your mandate, if everything I've set up to this point doesn't matter to you, it matters because the law says it matters. So if we don't follow the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, as well as 9 CFR 313, that's a group of regulations used to enforce that law, then you're going to lose your ability to operate. FSIS will regulate you. That will be the end of stunning for you. So at this point, there's kind of a, I guess, sort of a, almost an elephant in the room sometimes when I'm talking about this topic. It's one that I grappled with a little bit too. A lot of these pictures that you see in this program are actually me working. I used to manage the meat lab at the University of Wisconsin-Madison while I was in graduate school. So there was one point actually earlier in my career, I later went on to study animal welfare, but I was a meat science emphasis for my master's program where I thought, you know, I'm killing animals for a living. So how can animal welfare matter to me? As a matter of fact, it matters very, very deeply because you're the last person that's going to have any impact on that animal's life. So you have the opportunity to send them out without any pain or suffering or distress, or you could really screw it up. And so that's kind of a big thing to carry. If you really think about it, it's a big obligation. It's a big responsibility. And you should look at it that way. You play that last step in every animal's life that you slaughter. So now that I'm hoping we've done a little bit of justification of why we're here and why we're doing this, now we need to get into the dry stuff. And so I figured I'd get into this first because I can wake you up later with the fun things. So we're going to look at some laws first because you need to know what sort of environment that you're operating in. So the Humane Slaughter Act is 7 U.S.C. 1901, 9 CFR 313 are the regulations, the group of regulations that are used to enforce that specific law. As far as the history behind the Humane Slaughter Act goes, one thing that's kind of interesting about this is that it didn't pass easily. And the Humane Slaughter Act really hasn't been around that long in the grand scheme of things. So the first attempts to try to pass humane slaughter regulation here in the U.S. were in the mid-1950s. That was pushed by Hubert Humphrey. In 1955, the USDA really worked hard to make sure that those bills didn't pass. The general thought was that regulators shouldn't be, or well, the government shouldn't be responsible for overseeing slaughter methods because the people who are slaughtering the animals know more about that procedure than the government does. The issue with that, though, is that if nobody was watching, we have this tendency, it's this sort of, probably one of the not so great things about our human species in general, is that if nobody's looking over our shoulder, sometimes we'll cut corners or we'll give ourselves a break and things start to drift a little bit. And so that's one thing that we kind of see happen. That's one of the reasons the regulators are in our plants, so that we make sure that we maintain food safety, that we make sure that we're actually upholding what we believe is correct as far as humane slaughter goes. That's the reason why they're there. They're there to keep us from drifting. I know for some of you, you're thinking, actually, they're there to give you headaches, but not in the grand scheme of things. So, the original attempt to pass that legislation didn't go through. In 1958, Humphrey pushed it again. And so, at that point in time, the thought was, wow, this guy is persistent. He's going to try to make this happen. And so, the next attempt that could be made to sort of stop the legislation was to turn the bill into what's called a study bill. I don't know if you guys have heard of study bills before, but this is where most potential laws go to die. It's like purgatory for laws. So, in essence, here's what they did. The Senate Agriculture Committee said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to strip most of the requirements out of this law, and then we're just going to take a look at it and see how it might apply, how it might work. And so that's what they call a study bill. They study what sort of effect it might have. Now, Humphrey realized that was probably going to happen, and so he started debating those changes. He actually spent 7 straight hours debating this thing, and it finally passed. And so it was signed into law, and the effective date was June 30th of 1960. So it took about 2 years to get the regulations written and to get the plan laid out for how it was going to be enforced. Now, even at that point, though, one thing that's kind of interesting about the whole thing is that FSIS inspectors actually weren't given the ability to stop the line if they saw something associated with humane slaughter, any sort of violation of the Humane Slaughter Act, until 1978. So for about 20 years, actually about 18 years, it ran with no teeth in it. So it was more symbolic than anything else. So the Humane Slaughter Act of 1958 was the original version here. And there were some things that were included in the Humane Slaughter Act, and they're listed here. The two big things that actually stand out are the description of acceptable stunning methods. There are some descriptions of acceptable handling methods as well. There's an express exemption from pre-slaughter stunning for religious groups. For the most part, that's going to include people of the Jewish and Muslim faiths. And at the time that this was passed, it covered about 80% of our U.S. slaughter facilities. Now, at this point, it's moved to anybody who's inspected. So that includes state facilities as well. So the Humane Slaughter Act carried over to state-inspected facilities in 1967. In 1967, the Wholesome Meat Act was passed. Now, the Wholesome Meat Act essentially required that states had to come up with their own inspection programs, or they had to give that jurisdiction to the federal government for enforcement of food safety regulations. And so it was in the 1960s when we started to see that the rules regarding humane slaughter also started to apply to state-inspected facilities. In 1978 is where we saw those amendments put in place. So this is where we saw the broadening of that Humane Slaughter Act to cover all USDA-inspected slaughter plants. It also included the allocation of authority to USDA line inspectors to stop production if they saw a violation. So up until that point, they could see it, they could document it, but there was nothing they could really do. One interesting thing about this is that if you look back through the non-compliance record, you'll actually find that there are more NRs written for Humane Slaughter Act violations after about the year 2000 than what you'll find before that time, like over the whole life of the Humane Slaughter Act. A lot of that actually has to do with pressure from activist groups, undercover videos and things like that, where it was shown that the USDA may not have been enforcing to the extent that they should have been. Nowadays, humane handling violations are one of those things that can get a plant shut down very quickly. Very, very quickly. As a matter of fact, one common thing that I hear from larger federally inspected slaughter facilities is that that is the one thing that will get their plant closed faster than anything else, even faster than food safety issues in a lot of cases. So it matters. It's important. So as far as that law goes, that original law, there were some clear purposes that were laid out for the passage of the Humane Slaughter Act. Those four purposes are listed here. I pulled them right out of the text. One was to prevent needless suffering. The realization was there that the potential existed for animals to suffer if we didn't handle them humanely and stun them effectively. To improve safety and conditions for workers. This kind of makes sense, right? Can you imagine how dangerous that would be to try to live shackle and hoist like a 1,500-pound steer and then try to stick? You know, and that's something that has happened during ritual slaughter procedures. It's dangerous, really, really dangerous. It also had the purpose of improving meat products in general, quality for the most part, and it would increase economy of slaughter operations. If we go back to that live shackling of bovine, I'm pretty sure everybody in the room, if they had to slaughter a beef animal, would certainly want to have some sort of pre-slaughter stunning method if you wanted to get anything done in a day other than go to the hospital. And so it also served to increase the economy of slaughter operations. And this is one of the beautiful things about animal welfare improvements is that in many cases, you'll actually find that they pay for themselves. And so they may pay for themselves in increased efficiency, they may pay for themselves in improved quality or yield. Ultimately, there's usually a financial benefit that comes along with them. So if we continue to walk through this law here, the one big thing I want to point out to you guys is that there are two approved methods under the Humane Slaughter Act for stunning, and they really fall into classes of stunning. So if you take a look up here at letter A is conventional slaughter. And so in this case, the important thing to remember is that it was required that the animals are rendered insensible to pain by a single blow or gunshot or other means that is rapid and effective. And so this single blow or gunshot matters when you're dealing with captive bolt and firearms, if you're going to stun animals using those types of tools. This is the reason why you would see your inspectors take regulatory action if you have to place multiple stuns and your first stun is not effective. The second piece to it has to be rapid and effective. And so this has a lot to do with electric stunning in particular. I just had a conversation actually this morning with a gentleman about electric stunning. And one thing that I run into a lot actually in my home state, in Wisconsin, is the use of electric stunners that are more like electric immobilizers. So they put out around 110 volts of AC current. Generally speaking, when we stun pigs, like market weight pigs, we want to shoot for about 195 to 200 volts of direct current applied to the animal. So that lower voltage actually results in not enough amperage to typically stun the animal for a long enough period of time. You actually paralyze the animal. You don't completely knock them out. So that would be classified as a means that is not rapid, nor is it effective. And we have to make sure the animal is completely stunned then before being shackled, cast, thrown, or cut. So before any additional procedures can take place, the animal has to be unconscious. That's required. Then we get to the second piece here. The second allowable stunning method actually does not include stunning at all. So that's letter B down here. So if the slaughter is going to take place in accordance with the Jewish faith or any other faith, then the animal is allowed to lose consciousness by simultaneous and instantaneous severance of the carotid arteries, by cutting the throat. Now, here's the thing to remember with this one, is that you can't say, well, my letter A here was not rapid and effective. My stunning method didn't work, therefore that one's kosher. That's not going to work out for you. That's not a loophole for you. So you actually have to have representatives there from that specific faith that are involved in the slaughter procedure. It has to be absolutely obvious that that's what you're doing. And so it's not a loophole in any way, shape, or form. The express exemption that's included in the law is listed here. And so ritual slaughter in particular. And so when we talk about ritual slaughter, we're talking about the process of killing the animal in particular. That's what slaughter is really focused on. It's the killing of animals for food. And handling or other preparation of livestock for ritual slaughter are exempted. So there's sort of a gray space as far as enforcement goes. Generally speaking, the FSIS and any other inspection entity would enforce the Humane Slaughter Act up to the point where the animal is restrained for the ritual slaughter procedure. At that point, there's kind of a black box, and then they can continue enforcement after that animal has been cut. So it's important to remember that we still have to make sure that we're handling animals humanely before the cut actually takes place. So the next thing I want to do is dig into the regulations here. So the big thing I want you to take away from this up to this point is that what I've covered up to this point are some vague laws. When we make rules here,